Karen, welcome.
Thank you, Mike. Lovely to see you.
So for those who don't know, Karen Thompson is the co-founder of Responsible Project Management and is an independent consultant. After her first career in information systems and technology, she moved to academia and got her PhD in project management from Bournemouth University, which is not a million miles away from where I'm sitting now. And she remained there as a course leader for about 4 years before moving to become the senior academic leading responsible project management at the Schumacher Institute. And that's why I wanted to speak with you, Karen, about responsible project management. So it's great to have you.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So I think the first question I've got to ask you is, what do you mean by the term responsible project management? Because aren't we all responsible project managers?
Oh gosh, that's a leading question. Are we all? Well, I suppose it was born out of frustration, really, because projects create the future. And yet our profession has been very slow to respond to the challenges facing humanity, climate change, social injustice, and so forth. But in essence, what responsibility in project management means is thinking beyond just the idea that we're just there to produce outputs. I've always believed throughout my career that projects actually achieve change. If you don't achieve change, then why are we producing the outputs? Going back 30, 40 years, that was almost heresy in project management. But gradually, I think the profession now holds that view that it is about enabling change. And therefore, we need to recognise that projects have impacts, not just economic and financial, that is typically where our focus is, but they all take place within an environmental context and a social context, whether we recognise that or not. And we sort of started out, and it's very much a journey. I don't think we've got precise answers. We set out to explore what being more responsible might mean in the context of project management. And it's first and foremost, it's about recognising those other dimensions and the stakeholders and their perspectives that are involved in the success or otherwise of the projects that we're trying to deliver.
Yeah. So, I mean, you talked about the environment and climate change. I mean, we hear a lot about green project management. How does your conception of responsible project management differ from what some people think of as green project management and the need to think environmentally in the way that we manage our projects?
Okay, a couple of things then to highlight in particular. We were aware when we started, and we were trying to build on all the existing initiatives there were around trying to incorporate sustainable development into project management. The key thing that distinguishes responsible project management, the way we've conceptualised it, and I say we have really been a movement that has brought together not just academics, educators and researchers, but also very much practitioners. But what distinguishes the approach that we took was about focusing on the individual project manager. Many of the other initiatives are sort of organisational level. Yeah. And there's also, even today, still an ongoing debate about whether we're talking about making the process that we go through when we are delivering a project, whether we're talking about making that sustainable or whether it's the outputs that we're making sustainable. That is still quite a big debate. We would argue that you need to look at both, and how on earth can you separate them? Where we are today, though, there's been a lot of progress made around delivering much more sustainable outcomes. But unless we actually look at that whole transition that we're trying to achieve, we need to look sort of much further afield than just our boundaries of our projects.
Yeah. Okay. So responsible project management seems to me kind of bears some relationship to Elkington's triple bottom line, the idea of the economy, the environment, and the community as well. So, have I got that right?
Yes, absolutely. We ran some social learning workshops very early on that brought together, as I say, not just academics, but practitioners as well. I haven't actually added up. I mean, a lot of certainly our ambassadors are academics, but even the academics, of course, as I'm sure you're aware, many of us, or most of us, come from practice into academia. So we defined RPM in terms of 3 values, and developed a manifesto. Now, the idea of the manifesto was very much modelled on the Agile movement. We looked and said, well, what's been the biggest change in project management in the last 50 years? And it's been, we would argue, the Agile movement. So signing a bit of paper and a manifesto may sound trivial, but when we look at and recognise the fact that Agile started like that, we thought, well, that's quite a good way to start. We didn't want to start in the academic area of, well, how do we define this? And because everybody's got a different idea about what being responsible means. There is quite a lot of literature, academically speaking, on responsible management. But actually, when you talk about greening a project, it's much harder than greening a business, because we have so many different supply chains. We exist temporarily, whereas most businesses are at least planned to be there indefinitely, and so on. So we came up with three defining values, one of which was conscious awareness. In other words, raising awareness of our impacts in the environmental and the social domain. Even, I would argue, redefining what we mean by the economic domain, because it's not just about the money, it's got to be about prosperity for everybody. We also drew on the idea of the circular economy that many of your listeners may have heard of. And what that's about is a regenerative approach. So that involves reducing waste, looking at what we can do to protect, nurture and restore the natural resources and social resources, and trying to make something that isn't just sort of start and stop, but as we can see it fitting in a natural life cycle. And then the third value is all about seeking harmony among the different interests over the short, medium and long term. And trying to balance that, harmonise those interests. Very, very demanding, very, very challenging. We recognised that right from the beginning, and we said we can't simply add to what we're asking project managers to do. This really needs to come down to really trying to change what people believe about project management and getting project managers to think about themselves more in terms of being enablers or facilitators of change, rather than just that very narrow focus on the outputs that the project has been tasked with delivering.
And I like that kind of thinking, because I've always talked about project management and change management being two ends of a spectrum rather than two different disciplines. We need to be able to play across the whole spectrum, albeit some of us are going to prefer to focus our attention on perhaps the, for want of a better word, harder project management aspects, and others will like the kind of softer thing. But I do like the harmony thing, because when I talk about handling resistance to change, and stakeholders will resist change, I do like the idea of harmonizing, and I use the metaphor of Aikido, which is about harmony in working with resistors, because it can be quite confrontational. So I really like that. So you said, you tried not to dive straight in and say, what do we mean by responsible? Let that emerge from the discussion. But what does this mean for a working responsible project manager? What am I going to do differently to the way I might have been taught 10, maybe even 5 years ago in project management? How's my life going to be different as a working project manager?
Okay, well, I think we're not talking about throwing sort of everything out that you've done up until now. There clearly is still a role for all the skills and techniques that we've learned and we know. And I would argue that actually, not only in their position as delivering the future through projects, but project managers also have many of the skills that sustainable development needs in terms of that ability to negotiate and discuss with a wide range of different stakeholders, not just shareholders, in other words, investors in projects, but all those who have a stake in the outcomes of a project. We've already got those skills, so we are very, very well placed, and I would like to see us building on that and really being, I suppose I would have to put bravery or courage up there as one of the things we really need to focus on. What we're certainly aware of, and I know across everybody now, I think across all the generations, recognises the challenges. So I think one of the key differences is about trying to help project managers recognise that they do have a lot of agency. Whether we recognise it or not, we make decisions all the time.
Yes.
As you quite rightly say, many of our certainly the investors, may well resist change. I would argue one of the things that sustainable development needs to do is to challenge this myth that doing something sustainably is always going to be more expensive. There are some very silly, trivial examples I can give, like turning the lights off saves you money as well as being good for the environment. So I think that's a myth that we need to work on.
Well, let's face it. Like if you think about the cost of something across the whole life cycle rather than just the implementation, then this whole life thinking is going to produce a much lower cost on if you do things sustainably.
Yeah, and a lot of the decisions will come up down to sort of who pays and when do they pay.
Yeah.
I think this idea that we can simply, for example, send our waste overseas to make it somebody else's problem instead of our own is clearly a very challenging thing. But also this idea that we can consume and use up resources now, and then that's future generations that are going to pay for that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you talked about these kind of stakeholder engagement skills. I think one of the things that you talk about on the website is systems thinking. So can you say a little bit, firstly, about what systems thinking is in this context and how that plays into responsible project management?
Absolutely. And I just first of all want to be clear that systems thinking isn't something new. I mean, I was trained in systems thinking as a systems analyst back 40 years ago. But every so often it does become more popular and come more to the fore. And I think now with the sheer scale of the challenges that we're facing, it is very, very timely and very appropriate to focus on that. So what do we mean by that? Well, one thing I mean is that many of the conventional tools of project management, like planning, focus on what we do know and almost ignore what we don't know. One of the things about systems thinking is to really try and uncover the things that you don't know about and to accept that there are different perspectives. And it's not about saying, well, this one's right, that one's wrong. They're all valid perspectives. And it's about, again, how do we harmonize those and have a much bigger, broader, deeper understanding of each other's interests and the interests of different stakeholders. So that's one aspect. But once you start recognizing that or start trying to uncover what you don't know, and not necessarily answering that, but saying perhaps that we won't know an answer to that until we get further along in the project, building that into our planning, and maybe not having just one project plan, but having a number of project plans that we might turn to if certain metrics change as we're going through the project. I mean, I know the Thames barrier, for example, Thames flood defences, they've done a lot of work around modelling different scenarios depending on how quickly global temperatures rise. So that idea that we would have different approaches depending on what we find out as things go along is one of the key things that I think we need to become much more aware of. We need the tools and techniques to do some of that. So I think the idea of anticipation and handling uncertainty come to the fore with this idea of systems thinking.
Yeah. One of the things that I always think about is trying to build into our project cycle pause points where we can reflect on what we're learning. And this goes beyond just formal gateways to review from a governance point of view, but actually recognizing there are going to be certain things that we learn that are going to change our direction, which I think some of the agile practitioners think they invented, but it's been around certainly since I've been managing projects in the early 90s. And that seems like a really nice idea, a really nice example of how that can work. So that's great. You talked a while ago about the different principles, 10 principles that you've got as part of the manifesto. Obviously, we haven't got time to go through all those 10 principles, although what I would say to people watching is that these are really very interesting principles and very worthwhile. So do take a look at them and we'll signpost them later on. But could you perhaps pick on some favourites, a small number of those principles that you think are going to be particularly relevant to our viewers and listeners?
Certainly. I mean, obviously, I would argue that they're all going to be relevant. There are probably different principles that are going to be more relevant in different contexts. But I suppose the two I would particularly highlight are two that actually, we originally started with 8, and then some other people in Spain did some research and they surfaced another couple, but actually were there originally in our guide as things that we thought were just so obvious we didn't need to state them. So they probably are two of the most important ones, which one was about engagement,
Right.
And of course, when yours and my time in project management, we've seen stakeholder. Well, first of all, management came into the bodies of knowledge relatively late, and then very rapidly changed from management to engagement. So I think there is beginning to be this recognition that you don't manage stakeholders, you don't tell them what's happening, you engage them in dialogue. So I think the principle of engagement is really, really important and crucial here. And I think the other one that came out later was the transparency. And that is something certainly a lot of people come back to, about transparent, usually transparent decision making. I mean, those are probably the two that I would headline. But I suppose also the first one, I mean, our first principle is about purpose. So understanding the purpose of a project. There can be many different perspectives on that. But from that flows the idea of the awareness. So I think those are the three that are probably very tied into our values. Yeah,
that's a good choice, particularly the purpose one for me, because if you don't know why you're doing the project, then all you are doing is becoming a functionary, a technocrat that's delivering stuff. And I think one of the things that marks out project managers moving from a kind of junior project manager for hire role to a professional that is contributing to their organization is they start asking the question, for what purpose? Because once we uncover the purpose, we can drill down and ask whether the project we've got is the best way to deliver that. And I think that plays into your comments about systems thinking. And I think it's fundamentally responsible to say, are we pursuing the right solution to deliver the purpose? I guess if you get high enough in the organization, you start asking whether that's the right purpose for this organization as well.
Now, I quote from, I don't know whether you saw it on the television, the SAS Rogue Heroes, where that exactly, I mean, I wrote down the quote because it's just so relevant. And that was, why do we need to know why? Well, it's so that you can adapt when things inevitably go wrong. You understand that purpose. It's not, as you say, you're just a functionary. So I think it's about being able to understand the context within which you're operating. And the other thing I think it does is quite often, and I'm sure many of your listeners will be aware of this, we have our project to focus on and to deliver a particular set of outputs. But in order to deliver the benefits, that depends on use. Now, use is optional or voluntary, usually, and there may well be a lot of other projects that have to happen in order to achieve those benefits that have been promised for our project. Depend upon other projects. So I think understanding the why helps uncover that and the uses that you might want to explore. And again, this is an example of things perhaps as project managers we need to do differently. We need to really ask some tough questions about what is actually going to ensure those benefits are delivered. And quite often it'll be things that are outside of our conventional scope of control.
That's spot on. And I think you're kind of not straying, that sounds a pejorative term, but you're moving from the project context towards the program context, which is actually where I spent most of my professional career, managing programs. And I think that's absolutely right. But the quote you gave, I'd not seen the program, but it did remind me very much of Nelson's concept of commander's intent, the idea that I'll tell all my senior officers what I want to achieve. We'll set out a plan, but then when that plan goes to pot, everyone knows what we're trying to achieve. They can improvise. And I think that is very much what we have to do as project managers, particularly as we move to program contexts where there is a lot longer timescales, a lot more uncertainty. So that's really nice. Thank you for that. And I think the next thing I want to pick up on is that, as I understand it, you, Karen, but also you, the responsible project management movement, have an ambition to use these principles as a basis for project management training. And as online PM courses started off and remains a project management training business, communicating and educating is my mission. Can you say a little bit about how principles-based project management training might work and what plans you've got in place?
I mean, I think it is a fundamental shift. I mean, at the moment, project management education and training tends to be driven by a body of knowledge, whichever one you're looking at. But that has never really adequately addressed the fact that projects take place in a context. I mean, we readily talk about every project is different, but every context is different. And at the end of the day, projects are things done by humans for humans. And yet this idea of a body of knowledge, that there's something fixed that you can go away, learn, and then manage projects successfully, has been demonstrably shown to be lacking.
Yeah.
So I think the idea of introducing systems thinking and a set of principles, and then you need to shift to looking at scenario-based learning. You need to be looking at, as well as the extra skills we've been talking about, really that sort of system, thinking about the system, the wider purpose, and so forth.
Yes.
So I think in terms of education, and if there are any educators listening to this recording, this is really quite a significant shift in educational terms, because it's not just about learning and memorizing the body of knowledge, even though a lot of the exams I know will try and get you to put that into a context.
Yeah.
We need to go much, much further. And I think some of these ideas about, for example, focusing on what you don't know compared to what you do know at the start of a project is very, very important. Particularly, as we've said, so that you can adapt as you go along. And also, it's always struck me that project management and that whole sort of body of knowledge really is written about this idea. It's about command and control. But in fact, if you could simply create a plan and everything ran perfectly, we wouldn't need project managers.
Yeah.
You come into your own as a project manager once you've got different people, maybe even different people being creative, doing things to respond to change. It's about trying to hold those reins and coordinate and harmonize some of those things, because you do want people to take initiative. You need them to when they get into uncharted territory, but you somehow need to, with that purpose in mind, be trying to harness that and steer it in the right direction.
Yeah.
I think actually how we educate project managers, I think it will increasingly see a shift away from just classroom-based learning. And I know there's examples of this already happening, not least is the apprenticeship movement, for example. And in fact, all my education post-18 has all been done part-time. So I'm a great advocate for this idea that we can't learn the stuff in the classroom. It's not theoretical. It is that combination of taking our theory and applying it in a practical situation. So the more we can do that and learn to reflect. I mean, you mentioned, I think, lessons learned earlier. I would probably say project managers, we're very good at having that thing, that learning the lessons. We identify them, but do we actually learn them?
Yeah.
The problem is project managers have an orientation towards action, and I'm as guilty as this as anybody. We finish the project, we want to get on with the next one. And of course, it's different to anything I've done before, so I won't necessarily, and it's not something you can do individually, learn the lessons of previous mistakes. And of course, we also come back to, given the challenges we face today and this need for a real reconceptualisation. And I don't know, again, whether you saw the headline, but recently I just heard that the Welsh government have stopped all their new road building because they can see the bigger picture, that this will lead to more traffic. And they really want to, I imagine, they want to stop and take stock of that.
Yes, I've forgotten the name, but there is a named law that effectively says that as you build more roads, you just take people on different routes and create different bottlenecks, and you never really fix things. The thing you said about context is really important, and I think possibly project management as a profession globally is victim of its own success because project management is now everywhere. I think the project management organizations, and without a doubt, PMI is guilty of this, and I think to a large extent, APM is guilty of it as well. We're trying to create project management qualifications and certifications, which are all things to all people, which means that some domains are getting left behind because project management exists in so many domains now. It used to exist. Project management used to be about heavy engineering, big civil engineering project. And now I think the civil engineers who are managing huge construction projects, huge capital projects, would be the ones who would say that the APM and the PMI are leaving them behind in favor of the ubiquitous business projects. And you know, PMI is driving a fusion of agile and predictive methods, which is great because all project management is hybrid project management, really. But in the States, a lot of construction project managers are saying, but agile is just totally inappropriate to our domain. In the UK, I think the APM does sometimes struggle to find project managers who really understand the construction domain, you know, in some of their work. So we're becoming a victim of our success. But as project management becomes part of every single domain, maybe we won't need a project management profession, we'll just need project management in every profession. But I like the idea of domain or context sensitive training, actually understanding the domain you're training in. So I like that. Following on from that, you talked about what, to a degree, responsible project management is and what we'll be doing differently and how we might be training differently. So what kind of practical tools and techniques would you put into a responsible project management training package? What will we see if we went on a training course with you or your colleagues?
Well, I think that developing this understanding of the impact of projects in the environmental and the social areas, mm-hmm. I think that is something we've barely seen in educational terms yet. So in terms of what we're doing, we have defined some courses that we hope to run in the future, very much focused around the sort of the structures and the principles or the values I've been talking about. But I think what we need to do differently is, as I say, develop this sense of agency. And I was very, very conscious of this when I was working within the university, which was that we had students coming through who had sustainable values, I don't like that phraseology, but for want of a better way of expressing it. And they certainly expected us to be teaching them, if you like, responsible project management, not irresponsible project management. But they didn't necessarily have a strong sense of agency. And this, of course, is what project management's all about. It's all about that agency and doing stuff out there. Yeah. So I agree with you completely. I think it should be in all the schools and should become ubiquitous. I certainly wouldn't want to return to the time when it was perhaps not recognised as something that people could develop the skills in. I think there's a risk if we talk about being very concerned with particular domains, we might go back to the days of those becoming very isolated and not. I mean, it's a bit like project management has developed without being aware of much of the research and thinking that has gone on in developing in the field of management. Yeah. So we don't want to see that further fragmented, I don't think. But one of the biggest changes, I think we need to work out how to do this in the classroom or to develop this in the classroom, is this idea that, as I say, it comes back to this idea of a body of knowledge that you can just refer to and execute. I've been saying a lot recently that we need to learn together fast. So much of the existing information is written around the idea that you can go to other people and ask them and they will give you an answer. The fact is that we don't yet know, nobody on the planet knows how we can live sustainably. Yeah. How 8, 9 or 10 billion people can live on this one finite planet. Yeah. Nobody has all the answers. And we're going to need some pretty radical thinking in some sectors. Yes. To actually shift that and for the real sort of systems level transformations to take place. So I think project managers are well equipped to play a leading role in that. I'm not saying that your very junior project manager can take a leading role in that necessarily, but they can certainly start to ask difficult questions. Yeah. So I think in this sense, I think this idea of being responsible challenges not just project management, but it challenges really all educators. I know across all, certainly a bit, I mean, my area was business, the business disciplines all need to start thinking about how they need to rethink with those other considerations, because the whole of our sort of developed world has been built on the idea of growth, and we're now recognizing we can't just keep on growing. We have to think in a circular way about how can we create the resources before we actually go and use them up. Yeah. I'm going to ask you in a minute about this circular thinking, because I think it's one of the most important ideas that is part of the corpus of thinking that you gather together on the website and in the thinking. But I want to come back to this asking difficult questions, because it seems to me if you're an experienced project manager with a fair bit of authority, you can carve out, even in a difficult environment, you can carve out an environment of psychological safety within your project team, which allows these difficult questions to be asked. But where there is no psychological safety, difficult questions are going to get pushed to the bottom. So what advice have you got for project managers who want to, firstly, ask the difficult questions,
of their sponsors, of their steering groups and boards, possibly of their clients. And secondly, the second question will be, what advice have you got for project managers to create that sense of safety within their project so that their teams can start asking the difficult questions, which will, I hope and I believe, will generate a better project. So first of all, how do project managers go about asking those difficult questions?
Well, as you're quite right to talk about psychological safety. In terms of change management theory, you'll know that that's absolutely fundamental to any human beings changing anything they do. They have to feel psychologically safe. But this is also why we need transparency, which is why that was a really important one of the principles that we need to bring out. I think recognizing the difficulty. I think one of the things that worries me is this idea that we can just equip people with a certain finite little box of knowledge and that they can go out and do the job. I think recognizing that this is a massive challenge and we can't just turn to somebody and ask and expect them to have the answer. So I think, and that is especially in the developed world where and again, I find this quite difficult to relate to because it's never been me really. I've never been afraid to say I don't know. But I think just creating a culture both within the classroom where we are educating the new generation of project managers, but also in the workplace, that's probably one of the biggest single things. Actually, you get brownie points for identifying the things you don't know and asking questions about them, not in a challenging way, but just in a way that recognises that these are not things we can assume. I mean, one of the things I used to teach my students very, very early on, with whatever the models was where we were looking at, whether it was work breakdown structures, network diagrams, or Gantt charts, in some cases there's a right and wrong answer, but not very many actually. In most cases, the answer will be, it depends. And what it depends upon are the assumptions you've made.
Yes.
Just to drop in another quote that I absolutely love. If you assume, Mrs. Joe Lycett, if you assume, you make an ass of you and me.
Yeah.
You can say, well, I imagine this might be the case, or my guess is this, but actually recognizing the degree of uncertainty is fundamental to getting that extra information that somebody else might have. Until you ask, you don't know if somebody else knows. Or if you go around and talk to various people who you think might have the answer and nobody's got the answer, clearly you as a project manager then know there is a gap there, that if your project depends upon that, you need to have some problem-solving tools in your kit bag that you can pull out and say, okay, let's all get together and try and brainstorm this and then see. And then crucially, we need to test some of that knowledge that we think we might have.
Yeah.
Again, rather than assuming things that are okay or are known. I mean, the story of the Millennium Bridge in London, of course, that was a classic example of where the things they didn't know were never tested. We had a bridge built and then it wobbled under certain conditions. One of your key jobs as a project manager is to flesh out the things you don't know and test those, or find ways to conduct experiments to test things very early on, because you can save a huge amount of money by doing that and not leaving it until, we get to the end and, we didn't know that.
Yeah.
So I would say actually creating that culture, back to what we can practically do, to always being open to those questions and encouraging people to feel safe to say, I don't know, let's find out together.
Yeah. Well, I guess that kind of answers both points. So let's come on to circular thinking, because you've alluded to it. And it seems to me to be one of the most powerful and pivotal ideas in responsible project management. So it seems like a good place to end, recognizing, of course, with circular thinking, there is no end. But there will be an end to this, to this conversation, I'm afraid. Tell us what is circular thinking and how does it enhance our project management?
Well, I think you've touched on one of the most important points there. I think this webcast will obviously end. But just our view of project management as having a start with inputs and processes and then an output and then it ends, I think is desperately damaging, because those impacts that we have across all domains, economic, environmental and social, will last beyond the end of our project. They may even last forever as we as humans can conceive it. So actually becoming more aware of that is crucial. So the things I actually made a note of and jotted down in terms of what the very practical aspects of this are. One is, again, circular economy. Typically, the headline is normally about removing waste or reducing waste, but also looking when you say this is an idea, you have to think, how far can I take this on my project? But this idea that the only resources we will use are the ones we create. And actually, if you start a project like that, I mean, there are some great examples out there, but it just completely changes your thinking about what you can and can't do. So actually thinking about what resources do we need? I mean, in the social area, and I would typically hark back to my own background in software development. I know people have talked about the environmental impact of software projects is negligible. We don't need to worry about that. But again, you may well be aware in the last few months, we've seen a lot in the media about the impact in the cold places where we thought we could put computer processing because we wouldn't need to use so much energy cooling it down. Now we're finding there are detrimental effects to the local environment, where that extra heat going into the rivers is very damaging. Yeah. Just one very, very small example. But the social area and the social value and the way in which what we're doing will change that, and actually understanding that. I mean, I'm very conscious of that in terms of looking at older people, and we're seeing a lot of technology where, say, the banks are going very automated. We are cutting out a lot of older people from accessing their bank account. So I think looking at how we can, and that's a software and computer systems problem that we might think doesn't have an impact socially, but actually it is, and that's been in the media a lot recently. So I'm saying, and then also about this harmonising interests over the short, medium, and long term. I think that, and again, this is receiving press is receiving attention now in the press. This idea that we can do something now for short-term gain, and either that the long-term doesn't matter, or that somehow we'll figure it out in the future, I think really is quite flawed. And again,
I think the problem with a lot of those social examples is, and this is not an argument against democracy, but frankly, democracy is at fault because a politician has a 4 or 5 year time horizon, depending on the electoral cycle. Their one priority is to get elected in 4 or 5 years' time, or for their party to get elected. So they're not thinking 10, 20, 50, 100 years. So, yeah, and I don't know what the solution to that is, because I don't like the alternative to the alternatives we've got at the moment to democracy.
This is the role the media has. We all need to be asking much harder questions of our politicians. Yeah. We need to try and surface, in particular, the vested interests that drive a lot of decisions, both in politics and in big business. Yeah. And again, I could talk at length about the way that the playbook used by the tobacco industry is now being used by the fossil fuel industries. Yes. Again, none of this is rocket science, but we all need to become much more aware of the consequences, and it needs to be real for us. Yes. This is my criticism, where there is one of sustainable development, is it has historically been framed about being about the future. This is not. Not only is the fact that what we thought was about the future back in the 80s and 90s, that is now. Yes. But also it's the decisions we make now that affect that future that we can have, both personally and our children. But it's not just about saving the world for our children. It is about some of the consequences being experienced in certain parts of the world now. And it's not going to be, much of the developed world is already experiencing some of those things. I mean, the example I've been citing is the 40 houses burnt down in the middle of London as a result of the heat wave. Yeah. The science seems to be no longer refutable. It seems like, one of the examples you gave in the context of circular thinking is also an equally good example, I think, of systems thinking. We build technology, and technology is massively facilitating and enfranchising. It gives people the ability to do things they couldn't do. But for every, for want of a better word, younger, technologically minded person that finds the software allows them to do things, there may be someone who can't afford the technology, or isn't ready to adopt it because they are older or have different life experiences. That becomes disenfranchising because the software or the hardware becomes the way we do things. And that's not about long-term versus short-term. It's about seeing that society is not homogeneous. The people who develop the software are not typical of the whole of society. Indeed, yes. Thank you for sort of highlighting that. And indeed, of course, I'm relatively optimistic, actually, because I think COVID exposed a lot of these vulnerabilities.
Yep.
And it's clear that it is us here and now. It's our own futures and our own, just the next day. Things we do affect that.
So we've covered a lot of ground. If you had one tip for a project manager thinking, I like the sound of these ideas, what's my next step? What tip would you give them?
Oh, well, it would have to be to sign up to the manifesto, which they can find on our website, which is responsiblepm.com. You can click and sign up to the manifesto. I host a regular monthly, we call it a cafe, so there's no agenda, people just come along. Because as I said at the beginning, we recognise that project managers already have a really difficult job to do. Even if you take that view that you are just about delivering the outputs, that is becoming harder because of all these other challenges. But we didn't want to simply add to that burden, but it is about becoming an advocate for better outcomes from your project, and we need to support each other. So we started the cafe with the idea that we wanted to support people and provide a forum for people to come along, share their challenges, ask the group if they've got any ideas maybe, or indeed to offer stories of success from their own experience, because that's something else we need to do and need to do much more of. Because, of course, the thing that frustrates me is when a project goes well, the project manager is invisible. So we hear all about the failures, but we don't often promote the successes. And both in terms of sustainable development and RPM, we are at that point where we need to start sharing stories of success about how we're going to adapt to the future. It's not just about preventing climate change, it is about the adaptations that are going to be needed. And again, it's not just about social inequity, it's about what can we do positively. Yes. So I think my takeaways would be to sign up to the manifesto. Our events we manage through Meetup. You'll find the links on our website, so come along to some of our events and start advocating, but don't be afraid to say, I don't know, and reach out within your organisation. And you'll hopefully, as we gain momentum and as the challenges facing society as a whole get taken more seriously, and I think they are, but no one person has the answers and no one individual has. So don't be afraid to ask, and don't be afraid to say, well, I don't know, but I know how we can perhaps make some progress towards finding out. Yeah,
great. So you've told us how people can get involved in responsible project management through the website. The last question is, if someone wants to get in touch with you, engage with you as an individual professional, how can people best do that?
There is a link to contact us on the website, but I can also be found on LinkedIn. I think if you search for Dr. Karen Thompson, there won't be too many Karen Thompsons pop up.
I'll put a link. One of my closest friends is also called Karen Thompson, so there are plenty of Karen Thompsons around, I'm sure, but there's only two in my life. So I'll put a link to that. That's great. In fact, I think that's how we first got in touch. I saw one of your posts and found it really intriguing. So I'm glad that after a couple of months of conversation, we're having this conversation. So Karen Thompson, the Dr. Karen Thompson, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mike.
Please do give us a thumbs up if you like this video. I'll be creating loads more great project management content, so please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of it. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.